It was an extraordinary Oval Office meeting, unlike anything we've ever seen.
You got to be more thankful, because let me tell you, you don't have the cards. You're gambling with the lives of millions of people. You're gambling with World War III. If you didn't have our military equipment, our military equipment, this war would have been over in 2 weeks.
In 3 days, I heard it from Putin, in 3 days.
You're either going to make a deal or we're out.
Next.
This is going to be great television, I will say that.
This is Washington Week with The Atlantic. Corporate funding provided by...
In 1995, two friends set out to make wireless coverage accessible to all. With no long-term contracts, nationwide coverage, and 100% U.S.-based customer support. Consumer Cellular. Freedom calls.
Additional funding is provided by Koo and Patricia Ewan for the Ewan Foundation, committed to bridging cultural differences in our communities. Sandra and Carl DeLay Magnuson, Rose Herschel and Andy Shreves, Robert and Susan Rosenbaum, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you. And now from the David M. Rubenstein studio at WETA in Washington, here is Washington Week with The Atlantic.
Good evening and welcome to Washington Week. I'm Franklin Foer. Jeffrey Goldberg is away. This week, President Donald Trump abandoned Ukraine and its President Volodymyr Zelenskyy in an Oval Office meeting that devolved into a display of raw anger. The fallout has been swift and intense. Some Republicans are calling for new leadership in Ukraine, while some European allies are breaking with the United States. There's a lot to sort through, but here to help us make sense of it all are Peter Baker, the chief White House correspondent for the New York Times, Jonathan Karl, the chief Washington correspondent at ABC News, Ashley Parker is my colleague and a staff writer at The Atlantic, and Nancy Youssef is a national security correspondent for the Wall Street Journal. Welcome back to Washington Week. Peter, history will remember Volodymyr Zelenskyy as a great defender of democracy, and today he was booted from the White House. Yeah. You wrote that today was like anything you've ever seen in all your years covering the White House. Unpack that for us.
Well, look, I mean, it's not that American presidents don't sometimes get frustrated or angry with their foreign counterparts. They just don't usually do it on camera and at the volume and intensity that we saw today. And it was a real, it was practically a shouting match. And he lashed out at Zelenskyy in a way that was personal, that was ferocious, and that was threatening, because he did say, as you point out at the beginning, that there are consequences. If you don't accept the deal that I make with Russia, that's it. We're out. Big consequences for Ukraine, which has been under attack now really for 11 years as Zelenskyy tried to educate Trump and J.D. Vance, only to have them not listen.
I want to remind our viewers of some of the strange dynamics at play. Let's watch this clip.
You're not in a good position. You don't have the cards right now. With us, you start having cards. But right now, you don't. You're playing cards. You're playing cards. You're gambling with the lives of millions of people. You're gambling with World War III. You're gambling with World War III. And what you're doing is very disrespectful to the country, this country. That's back to you. Far more than a lot of people said they should have.
Have you said thank you once this entire meeting? No, in this entire meeting, have you said thank you?
John, Senator Chris Murphy and others have described this as an ambush. Was this, in fact, a premeditated confrontation?
No. I mean, look, the context here is earlier in the week, the president met with Macron, France. He met yesterday with Starmer of the United Kingdom. And those meetings went fairly well, even though the disagreements are quite deep between the United States and our European allies right now. This was not expected to go this way, but I will tell you this. I'm told that before Zelenskyy arrived at the White House, there was a pre-meeting in the Oval Office with the president, with Vice President Vance, with the Treasury Secretary Bessent, who, of course, went to Kyiv and met with Zelenskyy, with Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, with the National Security Advisor, Mike Waltz. And Trump, in that meeting, was quite irritated and quite angry, not interestingly, so much at Zelenskyy. He was actually upset with his own team. He thought this minerals deal that they were supposed to sign, the framework, it wasn't even a deal, this was a framework, a phase one that was supposed to be signed today, was not strong enough for the United States. The United States was not getting a big enough share of Ukraine's natural resources. So he was primed to be. So
he wasn't spoiling for a fight, but he was in a grumpy mood.
He was in a that's fair.
Okay. Ashley, just parse J.D. Vance's role in this. I mean, was his intervention premeditated?
So what's interesting is when you watch these clips, the real moment when it goes more off the rails than it already is what you just played, where Vance starts going after Zelenskyy and saying, you haven't said thank you once in this meeting. And Vance is in many ways more strategic than President Trump, right? With President Trump, things happen when he's in, as you put it, a grumpy mood, right? Coming in there with a different demeanor might have led to a different outcome. But Vance is someone who has long been skeptical, even before he was on the ticket, of Ukraine, of sending aid to Ukraine. And it has been made clear before they even took office that if there was something he had the ability to control, it would sort of be the end of U.S. aid to Ukraine. So the fact that Vance would be very sort of dismissive and sharp and challenging to the Ukrainian president is not at all surprising and is very in line with who he is and what he actually genuinely believes.
Is there any sort of internal debate about Ukraine policy? When you described that meeting earlier today, are there factions who are, Rubio and Waltz would seem to be?
There are clear differences of opinion on Trump's own team about this. J.D. Vance represents what you might call the Tucker Carlson wing of the party, very anti-Ukraine, not just anti-U.S. support for Ukraine, but suggesting that Ukraine is the bad party in that fight. Look, when J.D. Vance went to Munich and gave that speech, and he said that Europe's own policies, the European countries and how they treat their own people is more of a threat to security in Europe than Russia or China. That is not something you would have seen Marco Rubio say. That's not something you've seen Mike Waltz say. Both of them have been on record for a long time supporting a Ukraine funding. But the question is any of that expressed in the meetings? Right. Are they actually challenging Trump on this point? And I don't get a sense. After this meeting, Marco Rubio put out a statement on X, a post on X, formerly known as Twitter, and said that he couldn't be more proud of the way Donald Trump stood up for his country.
It feels like if you looked at Secretary Rubio's body language, that might be the closest you could get to an expression of his true feelings.
Yeah. But Nancy, I'm relying on your telepathic skill, which I have faith in. What do you think Zelenskyy was thinking as he entered this meeting? What was his expectation as he walked in?
Well, I think at the minimum is that the war and the U.S. support is at jeopardy, and how you can then end this war, because the pathway that was supposed to happen today, believe it or not, this was supposed to be a positive meeting. It was supposed to end with some sort of framework for a minerals deal. And now he's finding this confrontation with what was the biggest backer of Ukraine militarily, $119 billion from one country alone. And so I think there was what we heard from him was agitation, that he was being attacked by an ally. When is the last time you saw a wartime president and ally being attacked by the United States? I think in some ways he was expressing frustration that a lot of Ukrainians feel because they have felt under attack by the president in this first month in office. And I think you started to see him, particularly in that Fox News interview afterwards, start to lay out a framework for what do you do if the U.S. is not going to be the kind of allied partner that they were just a month ago, that going forward they're going to have to depend more on Europe for weapons and support, and potentially have to conduct the war differently if they can't get the kind of weapon support that they've gotten throughout this war.
Before we leave the meeting itself, just watching the Fox News interview in the aftermath, there were a lot of people on Fox News saying Zelenskyy should have handled this differently. Just as a matter of course, if he had reacted differently, would there have been a different outcome?
It's possible. If you watch the entire thing, the first 40 minutes, there's some friction there, right? They obviously are stating different positions. And Zelenskyy is very intent on saying, I don't want a simple ceasefire because that simply empowers the Russians. It has to be a bigger deal, and you shouldn't trust Putin. He is not a good faith actor. And he's making these points to Trump, but he's really trying to convince Trump. He brings these pictures of Ukrainians who've been held prisoner right, and showing Trump how badly they've been treated by the Russians. He's trying to get through to Trump that Putin is not a good guy. But he doesn't have the defer and flatter gene that Starmer and Macron have, right? He doesn't play to Trump's ego the way these other foreign leaders have decided.
Well, it's not like that actually broke their strategy actually broke through with Trump.
You could argue it doesn't make a difference, but they don't get yelled at, right? And their goal in these meetings seems to be not to get yelled at. Zelenskyy has a lot bigger problems than being yelled at. His problem is if the biggest ally he has withdraws his support.
I mean, it may prove to have been a miscalculation on Zelenskyy. Not that he was the one that provoked this, not that this is his fault how this played out. But look, if he had played to Trump's ego, if he hadn't, gotten the kind of indignant response that he had to J.D. Vance, I mean, for good reason. But if he hadn't done that, cameras could have gone back. They could have had their lunch. They could have signed their preliminary agreement. There still would have been a lot more to go. But he's now in a very, very bad situation.
I want to play Lindsey Graham's reaction to today's spat.
The question for me, for the Ukrainian people, I don't know if Zelenskyy can ever get you to where you want to go with the United States. Either he dramatically changes or you need to get somebody new.
So, Nancy, where does this leave Zelenskyy?
Well, look, it's unusual we would take offense if another leader came and said you need to change your leadership, right? We have elections and we ask to be respected. And so I think in some ways that kind of helped Zelenskyy having a U.S. senator say that you need to change your leadership. But he goes back to Ukraine without the very thing that he came to get. And so he is politically damaged. Now, does that mean that there's a change in leadership? Maybe not. But he goes in having to now plead with his European partners for support. He is not as strengthened as I think he hoped he would be at such a critical time in the war. But I don't know that they change leadership right away. But perhaps this is the first domino to fall as we start to see changes in Ukraine. Now, having said that, under Ukrainian law, you can't have elections during wartime. And so technically he stays in place. But is he hurt politically? Particularly with the war going not as well as Ukraine would like and facing bigger threats from Russia? Very likely so.
I think it's important to remember that the people who have been agitating for change in leadership in Ukraine are in Moscow.
Right.
This has been the Russian line for a while now, and Trump has adopted it. He came in with this dictators without elections line, which is straight out of the Kremlin playbook. Right. In fact, Zelenskyy was elected in 2019. They have not had elections because they are in a war zone martial law situation, but his approval rating, not 4% like Trump said it was, is actually 57%, which is higher than Trump's. And I think after this actually probably does rally people to his side in a sense of national, taking offense at the way the president treated him there.
Well, in the context here of the UN vote earlier this week, so the UN General Assembly, resolution condemning the Russian invasion on the anniversary of the invasion, to see the United States as one of just 14 countries to vote against that, to be with Belarus, Iran, North Korea, Russia. I mean, even China didn't vote against it. China abstained. It feels like we're seeing a fundamental realignment here of United States policy towards Europe and towards Russia.
But how much closer is Ukraine to collapse tonight after everything that's transpired?
You mean on the battlefield?
Yeah. Does this weaken? I mean, Ukraine is obviously weakens. And will arms shipments continue to Ukraine? I know that's been a question in some of the reporting.
So, there's been threats by the Trump administration to suspend it. Right now, we haven't had weapons going through. Not every sort of document has been signed to have those shipments go through, the ones that were approved by the Biden administration. And so whether that will resume at some point remains unclear. This seemed to have damaged it. In terms of the war goes on. Despite everything we've seen today, the war goes on, and we're not closer to stopping it. And in fact, I think what you're going to see is Ukraine depending more on European shipments of weapons to presume. I think there's a threat that they might have to lose some of that territory. Ironically, some of the territory that holds the very minerals that the U.S. was seeking. And in the longer term, they might have to revert to things like irregular warfare to sustain the fight. There are some practical challenges. I don't think either Europe or anyone else can replace the ammunition shortages that we're seeing. So they're going to have to make adjustments on the battlefield, but the war continues. And I think that's a really important part, that despite everything we've seen, this does not get us any closer to the outcome that everybody said they wanted, which is an end to the war.
What John just described was this massive realignment that's happening, and you've had Europeans coming here all week trying to essentially stop that from happening, and in order to get there to be some American backstop. And we've watched in the aftermath of today the way the Europeans have essentially rallied to Zelensky's defense. Does it feel like there's the transatlantic alliance just today crossed some sort of definitive threshold?
Well, let's just go back to Trump's first term, where it felt like the transatlantic alliance was uncomfortable, was nervous. There was always this sense that Trump was going to blow up NATO or rip up Article 5. But there was a sense that they could just wait him out, and that this whole, in their view, sort of fever dream nightmare would end after 4 years. And then Biden is elected. I was on Biden's first trip abroad, where he literally sort of says, America is back, right? Everyone can breathe a sigh of relief. Trump has now won again. It's his second term in many ways. I view it almost like a third term, because he lost the White House. He was at Mar-a-Lago, but he was never really out of power among the Republican Party, certainly, and not even really out of the discussion, right? So he's back again, and I think what you were seeing, and not just today, but even after J.D. Vance's, Vice President Vance's speech in Munich, is a sense that this is what it is. This is the realignment, and Europeans are going to have to respond accordingly in a world where they no longer believe they can count on America as an ally.
Well, you know what's interesting in the first Trump term, he had a lot of the rhetoric upset our European allies. His rhetoric towards Russia, saying he trusted Vladimir Putin more than U.S. intelligence agencies. The fact that he raised questions about whether or not he would respect Article 5, whether or not he would withdraw troops from Germany, which he floated. But the actual policy was actually, very tough on Russia, largely led by people like Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, Jim Mattis, while he was Defense Secretary. What's different here is the rhetoric is the same rhetoric that upset our European allies the first time around, but the policies seem to be going in the direction of the rhetoric.
And also, just going back to that, I spent so much time covering Vice President Pence in the first term, where Pence was always dispatched to Eastern Europe to reassure the allies that what Trump was saying wasn't actually going to happen. Now compare that with J.D. Vance, who challenges Zelenskyy in the Oval Office and who goes to Munich to deliver the exact opposite message.
So, Peter, where does Ukraine go from here? I mean, what steps can he plausibly take to salvage his position?
I mean, he tried to smooth it over a little bit after he left the White House. He put out a social media post saying, thank you to America, thank you to the president, thank you for your support, the words that J.D. Vance felt he hasn't said enough. He went on Fox News and basically said similar things. He didn't apologize. He did say he regretted and was sorry about the exchange. And we'll see. Look, Trump is
didn't say he regretted his part of that exchange. He
that's
regretted
right.
the exchange.
I think that, but Trump is a volatile guy, right? And we see with Trump that you can, he can yell at you one day and then they can pretend it never happened the next, right? Just last week he said, well, this guy's a dictator. When we asked him yesterday, or I think it was yesterday, he said, did I say that? So he's able to move on in ways that sometimes other presidents might not be able to. But he's got it in for this guy. He just doesn't like him, and he hasn't liked him really for 5 years, 6 years now. It's not just this day.
And I think what we're seeing under this administration is that the policy is driven by those personalities, that if the president likes someone, then America likes them. And if he doesn't like that person, then the United States doesn't like them. And so that's one of the biggest challenges in terms of trying to repair
But Ashley, in terms of Trump's psyche and all of his tendencies, does this feel like a beef that is just etched in stone now?
It feels like a big beef, definitely, right? Like the gauntlet has been thrown. But to Peter's point, again, Trump is as Lindsey Graham often says, Trump likes anyone who likes him. So there's a world in which if Zelenskyy could sort of just utterly supplicate himself and kiss the ring. It seems like, frankly, Zelenskyy doesn't have that in him, as a wartime president who can't accept a deal that just gives Russia all the Ukrainian land that they seized. It's understandable, but I don't know, it may be irreparable, but I don't know that it inherently is. And the last thing that hasn't come up, but I just can't but help think of how this might have gone at least a little differently had all the cameras not been in there. And again, that is Trump's way. That's what he likes. But you could have seen this discussion if, I mean, J.D. Vance even turns to Zelenskyy and says, you're litigating this in front of the cameras. Well, to be fair to Zelenskyy, who invited all those cameras into the Oval Office? But it felt like by the end, and again, as Peter points out, it starts off tense, contentious, but not quite that. But when you have the cameras there, I mean, it reminded me, this betrays my age, but of like Jerry Springer Oval Office edition, right? And once it goes off the rails, then everyone wants to put in their point and insult the next person, and there was no way it was going to end without him getting kicked out of the Oval Office and no lunch for him, right? That's a TV kicker. That's not a diplomacy kicker.
More recently than Jerry Springer. I mean, look when Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer were in the Oval Office with Trump, and it ended up in a big blow up and a government shutdown that went on some days and eventually Trump had to back down.
John, do you think
even that wasn't as nasty though? I mean,
no,
it was really striking.
In the Fox News interview, it was striking that Zelenskyy decided not to apologize, that he made that strategic decision not to do it. What do you think his calculation is?
I mean, look, Trump might have seen an apology as a show of weakness. I'm not sure it necessarily would have worked, but it was striking. And Bret Baier in that interview gave him multiple opportunities. But you sure you don't want to? I mean, he really gave him the opportunity. But look, but Trump does switch on a dime on this stuff sometimes. I mean, look at the way he dealt with Kim Jong-un, fire and fury, and then suddenly. But one key point there is Kim Jong-un did write him essentially love letters.
Yes.
I don't know if you've seen them. I've read those letters.
Everybody has.
Yes. I mean,
there's an epistolary solution here.
The janitor in the West Wing has read those letters.
And Nancy, I just want the Kremlin is expressing unabashed glee.
Yes.
Dmitry Medvedev tweeted this tonight, that the insolent pig finally got a proper slapdown in the Oval Office. I mean, it does feel like the Russians are essentially living their best life right now.
Well, look, after what happened today, they are in a stronger position. Where is the pathway where you can see an alliance between the U.S. and Europe and Ukraine? You're seeing a division at a very time when they're making advances and pushing into Ukraine. And so for them to see that division led by the United States, I think if you're Russia, really signaled the thing that they've been trying to do from the beginning. Remember what Putin said, we can just wait out this alliance. And maybe this week indicated that they were onto that something.
Peter, you wrote a superb piece titled, "In Trump's Washington, a Moscow-like chill takes hold." What does today say about America and where it's headed?
Well, this is the irony, right? We're talking about Putin in terms of foreign policy, but that piece was about domestic policy. That piece was meant to say that a lot of the things we're seeing in Washington right now remind me, anyway, of what it was like in the early years of Putin's time in Moscow. My wife, Susan Glasser, and I were there for those first few years. You're seeing the chill, the takeover of the press, the intimidation of people, and the fear among people who don't support the president.
We need to leave it there for now. Thanks to our panelists and our viewers for joining us. For more on the fallout from Trump's meeting with Zelenskyy, be sure to read Tom Nichols' piece on theatlantic.com. I'm Franklin Foer. Good night from Washington.
Corporate funding for Washington Week with The Atlantic is provided by Consumer Cellular. Additional funding is provided by Ku and Patricia Ewan for the Ewan Foundation, committed to bridging cultural differences in our communities. Sandra and Carl DeLay Magnuson, Rose Herschel and Andy Shreves, Robert and Susan Rosenbaum, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
You're watching PBS.